So for this video, I'm going to try to embrace the whole retro futurist aesthetic with my knockoff members-only jacket and the vaguely cyberpunk influenced lighting scheme without turning this whole video into a joke. But this is going to be another installment of Why Do I Own This? A series of videos where I take a good hard look at my vinyl record collection and give an account as to why I've decided to own these plastic discs. If you're interested in engaging in that topic with me, I put a link in the description section below to my Discogs account where you can see an up-to-date index of all the vinyl records that I own. You can drop into the comments section below and let me know which of my vinyl records I need to answer for, and I think we'll have a good time along the way. My name is Adam McDormand, and this is Medium Quality. So this time we're taking a look at a couple of albums by an artist called Mitch Murder. And that name might strike you as a bit perplexing, considering he's an artist with a prolific musical discography that's mostly upbeat retrowave and synth pop. But name aside, I absolutely adore his music in all of its pristine nostalgia, evoking this kind of specific aesthetic of optimistic futurism. It's one where the prospect of the future, or the prospect of a future, isn't so grim and apocalyptic as it tends to be nowadays. It's much needed musical escapism that serves as kind of a stark contrast to the existential dread that constantly tugs at our stress-addled minds in the modern age. However, Mitch Murder is far from the only artist to embrace the sonic aesthetic of the 1980s synthesizers circa the early 2010s. So why is it that he's the one that's on my shelf instead of Miami Nights 1984 or Power Glove or Laserhawk or any of the other modern synth musical artists? In order to work our way toward the answer to the ultimate question of why do I own this music, we need to take a step back and consider the musical context that gave rise to this kind of music. And of course, while we do that, feel free to drop into the comments section below and let me know what your favorite synth music is. Whether you like to keep it old school like Vangelis or Tangerine Dream, or you enjoy the modern synth music resurgence from the last decade or so. Here's my thought. And I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but I think that this kind of music, this modern synth pop resurgence, owes a huge debt to the democratization of music creation tools in the early 2000s. By the time we get to 2010, basically any kid with an expensive MacBook and a cheap M-Audio MIDI controller had all of the tools necessary to make synth pop music, at least in theory. And there was this explosion of bedroom-produced electronic music that became the chillwave genre, even though that term may be a little bit of a dysphemism for the kind of music that was being created. You had artists like Washed Out, Toro y Moi, and Neon Indian that became really popular with my generation in the early 2010s. With their laid-back tempos paired with this kind of hazy, lo-fi production and vintage synthesizer sounds. All of it contributing to the genre's signature chilled-out vibe. And I may be starting to ramble, but suffice to say that there was a lot of cool music coming out during this time, and not all just within the chillwave genre. Meanwhile, in one corner of the chillwave scene, you had this group of artists who were taking what I would describe as a more complete embrace of the retro aesthetic, with the goal of kind of explicitly evoking the 1980s. The production was more pristine than lo-fi sounding, sometimes even aggressively so, sometimes taking some inspiration from like French house music or Italo disco, and this then would be accurately described as like a niche within a niche, and yet it reached something of a critical mass, at least kind of in the alternative music scene, after the release of the movie Drive in 2011. This movie stars Ryan Gosling in a really grim and violent depiction of kind of a 1980s action thriller movie. Personally, I think this movie was an important countercultural moment, if only on a very small scale. Now, the retrowave music scene has stuck around ever since, and obviously got a really big boost from the popularity of the Stranger Things television show and this persistent 1980s nostalgia that I think is only just now starting to give way to more of a 1990s nostalgia. And as popular as the sounds of the 1980s have been for the past decade or so, I have never met anyone who was a fan of, or even heard of, really, Mitch Murder. Until quite recently, actually. I made friends with a fellow YouTuber, kind of feels weird to call myself that, a guy that runs a channel called Snestalgia. He makes these really interesting videos about video games, particularly of the 16-bit variety. I'll put a link in the description section below so you guys can go show him some love. And we got to talking by way of Twitter about this album here, The Real Deal. And he had mentioned that he really likes how this album reminded him of like 1980s infomercials. And I thought that was a really great way to describe kind of what's going on in this album. It's bright, it's bouncy, it's optimistic, and it's also really short. And I've come to regard this EP, The Real Deal, as a very good primer on all of the music that Mitch Murder had made in the 7-ish years prior to that. From that point, sort of moves beyond the mastery of a very kind of retro sound into a more experimental phase. And 2 years later, you get this EP called Hardwired. And it's pretty much the exact opposite of that. It's dark, it's gritty, it's aggressive, and we'd be remiss to ignore the album artwork that's on display here. In 2 years, we go from this almost looks like something you'd expect to see as like this airbrushed artwork on the cover of a VHS to something that is very, very clearly influenced by the Japanese anime Akira, a seminal work of the genre, pretty gritty, pretty violent. Taken together, these two EPs, coming in at just under 45 minutes of music, show to me the broad range of emotional tones that an artist like Mitch Murder is capable of striking with a relatively narrow set of musical tools. So I think we're ready to answer the question, why do I own this? This is music that has resonated with me kind of on multiple levels. It came out of the alternative music scene, this kind of underground DIY, cool kids that aren't in the mainstream kind of vibe. And that's really how I defined myself for many, many years of my life. And yet this kind of 80s inspired retro futurism, synth pop kind of thing was not at all ashamed of its own kind of weirdness. Of course, it would be several years after that before I would be confident enough to embrace my own weirdness. But perhaps this is why this music continues to resonate with me all these years later. And of course, if you've ever heard of Mitch Murder, please drop into the comments section below. Let's be internet friends. Let's be weird together. And that's going to do it for this video, guys. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more, feel free to hit the subscribe button. Until next time, guys, keep spinning that good stuff. What a time to be alive.